I think I ought to give a little bit of introduction. I've wandered across about 10 or 12 disciplines and have a ridiculous range of sort of pieces of paper. But the basic common factor is I'm interested in problems and different ways of viewing them. And that's a creative way of looking at things. So I was asked to give this paper at the close of the disciplinarity session because I think that Katina knows this is the sort of thing I like to do. It's an intriguing question. I've only put up there what we were asked to say. What do we need it? And what are the pressures against it? I'm going to call it TN because transdisciplinarity is such a mouthful. So what are we talking about? Transdisciplinarity, lovely word. But alternatives include, from many points of view, multidisciplinary, multifunction team working, complex team functioning, and an almost unending list of management short terms. But the common factors are different disciplines being involved. The last two unambiguously involving headaches for management. They always do. So is interdisciplinarity or transdisciplinarity a new field, a mode of working, or something else? That question has been approached from a number of different angles by many people. So I just thought, let me have a look at some experience done that had a catalytic element in Australia, because that's a nice home-based thing, which we don't often get. So I fearlessly looked at a lot of the work done by Gerard Bremer in ANU, or at least catalyzed by her. So let's just explore the easy one, multidisciplinary working. Have you noticed it's rarely expressed as a person bringing multiple disciplines to bear? It's usually as a group, each with their own different disciplinary contribution, generally organized as segregated tasks. Well, in this paper, we'll look at some of the barriers a little bit later. But here it's all too evident what some of the problems are. First, power relationships, consultant and client, for example. Doesn't matter how good and how great the skills are on both sides, the catalytic effect is somewhat damped by the fact that somebody's going to pay you. This specific example has further ramifications on shifts of accumulated knowledge from client to consultant. It doesn't happen. Take a look at what's happening to the public service. Second, cost structures, which derive from organizational frameworks. Budgets and agreements can readily kill cooperative positive outcomes that are not budgeted for. Tell me a single person who hasn't run into that sometime in their career, even if it was an ideal thing to do. So let's go to transdisciplinarity. What it isn't is a group of people with different disciplines cooperating in team or teams. What is it? This is my proposition. It's when the cultures of two or more disciplines collide or are brought into contact. Why? Because then different cultures actually work together rather than undertake just their own disciplinary skills as part of a team of different disciplines. Only then is creativity enhanced. I'll use this perspective to explore the issues that emerge from it and use the term TD as an abbreviation. It's just too long to use what's it? Transdisciplinarity? Yes, shorter words are better. We also have to be very careful with security. I was asked to talk about security and I thought, well, physical security is an objective, perhaps personal safety. Digital security of systems, well, enterprise IT security. Data security, creating security from or for access, abuse or unapproved utilization or retention. Every single one is a security issue. These variations are enough to confirm that multiple disciplines and perspectives are needed to span these and the other working definition. Here I give credit to ANU. In the early 2010s, they did an ARC special center and a lot of interesting people from quite a wide spread of places and countries. And they mixed academic and police staff. But this was not that successful. And I will make a quote here from one of the participants. It is clear that different agencies and researchers value such initiatives differently. If we dig into that, it means they regard different things as significant. They dispense with other things they don't regard as significant, They hear some things, they don't hear others. They look for some things, they look for others. Let's summarize that. A cultural set. So why do I address TD as a clash of cultures? I've illustrated it in the last slide. But what next? The ANU team, which are academics predominantly from arts disciplines, subsequently moved towards defining transdisciplinarity as a new discipline. I believe this is an academic disease, which I haven't yet caught. Later workers moved towards treating TD as a way of being, which seemed to me a perfectly sensible escape route. But you can see why, because it's something that doesn't quite fit any of the disciplines, and it's somewhat between them. And unless you're actually open to thinking that way or responding to it, it isn't going to work very well. So a way of being or a way of analyzing problems is a perfectly adequate way of specifying it. I'll now give them full credit for an early and valuable comment, because I think it's really worth looking through. There's a lack of strong institutional structures for transdisciplinary research that are necessary for establishing scientific communities, I'll pick that up, in which a state-of-the-art can be developed. Transdisciplinary research groups enter into a variety of problem fields, such as health and environmental issues, technology development and social conflicts. Notice that each of these are groupings rather than collisions between these areas. In addition, cooperation and mutual learning between participants from various institutional contexts and heterogeneous backgrounds take place on a project-related basis. That sentence is sufficiently long that I could have been guilty of it. Frequently, they do not outlast the temporary context of the research project or program. As a consequence of professional mobility and lack of systematization, the lessons learned on the job are seldom passed on to others for capacity building. It's a very good quote. It raises many of the right questions, and I really want to give it full credit. Ironically, there were very few scientists in the broader group involved in this program. In fact, it was actually a lawyer making that point. I happen to be a scientist. I'm a nuclear physicist, amongst other things. So I don't quite agree with the fact that they had any scientific communities involved. So why pick on scientists? Because there are clear groupings of different scientific and engineering disciplines that work well together and have demonstrably created many fresh findings and achievements. Think of the Large Hadron Collider. When they designed the second generation, it wasn't possible to do any of the things that they wrote for the criteria, and the scientific and engineering work that had to work together as a result produced amazing creativity and a quite stunning product that they have. This is applied transdisciplinary working in that narrow group. So let's take some other groups. Medical, engineering, computing. This is one that people now regard as multidisciplinary. I think it's actually transdisciplinary. Medical criteria are very different from engineering, although engineering and computing have converged to a great extent. Particle physics, civil engineering, cryogenics, and computing. The Large Hadron Collider is a great example, and there are many others. But in each case, the philosophical cultures that deal with them have very large overlaps. This is not always the case. And if we want to get the best of transdisciplinarity, we've got to go a little broader. So recognizing the makeup of the ANU stream chosen to illustrate this presentation, we can also add a very different example from an arts tradition: visual arts, sculpture, engineering, psychology, acoustics. The common culture there is remarkably consistent, although each of these disciplines regard themselves as very different. They've been rather successful. If we want examples of successful transdisciplinarity, just look there. So do we need transdisciplinarity? Is it useful? Well, in my view, clearly we do, as examples of cultural collisions are very evident in the groups just discussed. These productive integrations are rarely described as TD, more as a great way to work. Some TD literature focuses on this great way to work in a series of frameworks. I'll give you a reference there for it. It's quite a good one. but largely omits the crucial productive TD aspect. Cultural differences are a productive action, not something to overcome by specialized problem formation and working methods, which incidentally is another development of this particular theme. So, what are the barriers? Well, the obvious ones are organizational structures, which very rarely work very well when you have to work with very different kinds of disciplines. They have their own structures. Barriers between them can be quite substantial. A lot of organizational psychology is needed for that. Academia, maybe you don't see it, but certainly the moment you move even an inch outside, it hits you in the eyeballs. Budgetary framing and constraints, that one hits you in the wallet, and they're very tight. Lack of provision, either budgetary or organizationally, for unexpected positive outcomes. Major barrier. If you don't budget for the creative outcome, you're not really going to get it, or at least it's going to be seen as a problem. Limited multidisciplinary experience in management. This is very rarely mentioned, but the problem is that the managerial cultures we have now have almost become a contracting monoculture. I'm overstating a bit, but not nearly as much as I'm afraid you'll find if you look at it. Unless you have some understanding as to what happens when you have multiple disciplines as resources instead of things to do a job with, you won't see it, and you won't respond to it, and you won't support it, because you have your budgets to deliver. The lack of creative forward planning can deal with all of those, but it's a rarity. So some of the TD moves to frameworks have already recognized some of these as problems. So to be fair, that some of those, but not quite in this summary form. So what's my own perspective? Individuals with a real understanding of very different disciplines are unusual. I happen to be one of them. Probably why I was asked to give this talk. There is little reinforcement for individuals holding multiple specialities within organizational cultures, including academia. I may be a nuclear physicist, an engineer, computing, but I'm currently earn my crust as an honorary fellow in Conservatorium of Music. Not terribly common, unfortunately, because it's such fun talking to people like that, and ideas flow. Observing the minimal responses to the attempted systematic promotion of transdisciplinarity at the University of Melbourne by a very senior professor, very good in medical and computing areas, I might add, and his lack of recognition in every presentation of the cross-cultural barriers suggests to me that the key requirement for successful transdisciplinarity, apart from the academic new field style territorial grabs, is support for individuals who can exemplify TD. Otherwise, only problem needs will drag it in. Well, what about security? Security, I've actually made a couple of my points in question, so I won't repeat them. But we do have to look a lot more widely at what comprises security, what is perceived as security, and therefore what is perceived as threats to be addressed. By getting groups of people with very different disciplines together with that as an objective, instead of an operational task, we're quite likely to get some good results. But the fact that doesn't happen very often is one of the barriers. Now, this is a personal perspective. I've only been out of hospital 5 days, so I'm sure it would be better if I had a bit longer, but I hope it's been enough to start some thoughts. So if you want to follow up, there's some ways of doing it. Thank you.